Among history's most remarkable figures, George II was born on November 10, 1683, in Herrenhausen Palace in Hanover, a city in northern Germany. At that time, Hanover was a significant state. Among the many that divided Germany, George's father was King George I, the ruler of Hanover, who later became King George I of the British Empire in 1714. His mother was Sophia Dorothea of Celle, daughter of the Duke of Brunswick-Elneburg. She married George's father just before his birth, and George was their first child. They had one more child, a daughter named Sophia Dorothea, who was born 4 years after George. George's early life was marked by his parents' troubled marriage. When George was about 10 years old, his mother became involved in an affair with a Swedish nobleman, Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. In response to this, George's mother was placed under house arrest in Celle, where she remained for over 30 years until her death in 1726. George never saw his mother again after her banishment, and this affected his relationship with his father for many years. After his mother was sent away, George was raised by his paternal grandparents. He was educated by several tutors, one of whom was Johann Hilmar Holstein, who taught him languages. By the time he was an adult, George could speak German, French, English, and Italian, with some Latin as well. He had a strong interest in history and military studies, which would later play a key role in his life. George II's education was broad, focusing on languages, history, and military studies. He was taught by various tutors and became proficient in German, French, English, and Italian, and even had some knowledge of Latin. His primary interest, however, was military strategy and history. Growing up in a royal family, George was groomed for leadership from an early age, and his education reflected that preparation. On September 2, 1705, George married Caroline, the daughter of Johann Friedrich, the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a noble family in eastern Germany. Caroline was only 8 months older than George, and they were close in age, which made their bond stronger. They had a large family, starting with their son Frederick, who was born in January 1707. Frederick was the first of their 8 children. Over the years, they had 5 daughters and 2 more sons. Sadly, George William, born in 1717, died as an infant, and Caroline suffered at least 2 miscarriages and a stillbirth. Their marriage, though not without its difficulties, was one of mutual respect. George, despite having many mistresses throughout their marriage, still trusted Caroline to represent him during his official duties, particularly in the late 1720 and early 1730 when he traveled away from England. This period also saw George become a naturalized British citizen and take on important roles in Britain, including being made Duke of Cambridge in 1706, a sign of his future position as a member of the British royal family. George II's journey to the British Empire throne was shaped by both personal and political circumstances. In the early 18th century, Britain was in a period of uncertainty about its royal succession. Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, was childless and had suffered several stillbirths and early deaths among her children. This left no clear successor from the Stuart line. As a result, the British throne passed to George's father, George I, in 1714, because of his family's connection to the Stuart family through George's grandmother, who was a granddaughter of King James I of England. In 1706, George was given the title of Duke of Cambridge in Britain, a symbolic gesture meant to prepare him for future leadership. By the time Queen Anne died in August 1714, George's father succeeded her as King George I of Britain and Ireland. This marked the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasty's rule in Britain, although King George I was not fully accepted by the British due to his limited knowledge of English and his preference for remaining in Germany. The Hanoverian succession caused a lot of tension, particularly for George II's, who would eventually become the Prince of Wales. His relationship with his father was strained, partly due to his father's aloof and distant nature, and George II's growing popularity among the British people. This tension would eventually lead to a major falling out between father and son in 1717, which added complexity to George II's early years as heir to the throne. George II became king in June 1727 after the death of his father, George I. His ascension was a crucial moment in British history as it marked the continuation of the Hanoverian dynasty. However, George I faced several challenges early in his reign. His relationship with his father had been strained, and upon George's death, it became clear that George II's own position as king would not be without difficulties. One of the most significant challenges George II faced was his relationship with the British government. At the time, Britain was transitioning into a constitutional monarchy, where the powers of the monarch were gradually being limited and the role of Parliament was growing. Although George II had a strong interest in foreign affairs, he left much of the domestic governance to his Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, who would become one of the longest-serving prime ministers in British history. This arrangement allowed George II to focus more on military and political matters abroad, but it also led to criticism of his perceived lack of involvement in day-to-day affairs. Despite these challenges, George II took an active role in military matters, especially in European conflicts. His reign would see significant events such as the War of the Austrian Succession, where Britain's involvement would grow due to both George's interests in European affairs and Britain's ongoing rivalry with France. During his reign, George I was particularly active in military affairs, an area in which he had a personal interest. One of the most significant events during his rule was the War of the Austrian Succession, which began in 1740. This conflict was sparked by the death of Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, and the dispute over the succession of his daughter, Maria Theresa. The war involved several European powers, including Britain, which had a strong interest in maintaining the balance of power in Europe and supporting Austria against France and Prussia. George II's involvement in the war was notable because, unlike most British monarchs who remained distant from the battlefield, George II personally led British forces in Europe. In 1743, at the age of nearly 60, George took command of the British Army at the Battle of Dettingen in Germany. It was the last time a British monarch personally led troops into battle. The battle, though not decisive in the long term, was a victory for the British and earned George respect for his bravery. In addition to his military involvement, George II also played a role in shaping British foreign policy, particularly through his connections with other European powers. As the Prince Elector of Hanover, he had strong ties to the Holy Roman Empire, and this influenced Britain's alliances. His efforts to balance competing interests within Europe were part of a larger strategy to maintain Britain's position as a major power on the continent. George II's personal life, particularly his relationships, was marked by both loyalty and betrayal. He had a complicated marriage with Caroline, the daughter of the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach. While their marriage produced 8 children, it was far from perfect. George was known for his many mistresses throughout their long marriage, yet he trusted Caroline enough to represent him in official matters when he traveled, particularly in the late 1720 and early 1730. Despite his infidelities, George II seemed to have genuine affection for Caroline, especially toward the end of her life. When Caroline passed away in November 1737, George was deeply distraught. His commitment to her was evident in his decision to not remarry after her death, despite having many opportunities. The couple's relationship, while unconventional by today's standards, was one of mutual trust and respect in many aspects. George's relationship with his children, particularly his eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was fraught with tension. The father-son relationship deteriorated over the years, especially after Frederick's marriage in 1736. George's harsh treatment of Frederick would lead to a long-lasting estrangement, a familiar theme in the Hanoverian family. The War of the Austrian Succession, which began in 1740, was one of the defining conflicts during George II's reign. The war was sparked by the death of Emperor Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire and the subsequent struggle over the succession to his daughter, Maria Theresa. Several European powers, including Britain, became involved, with Britain allying itself with Austria to counter the threat posed by France and Prussia. Although the war primarily took place in Central Europe, it had significant implications for Britain, which sought to maintain the balance of power on the continent and protect its own interests. George II's role in the conflict was crucial, as he not only supported the war effort, but also personally led British troops in battle. In 1743, he commanded the British Army at the Battle of Dettingen, which became one of the few instances in British history where a reigning monarch took part in a military engagement. Despite the relatively small scale of the battle, it was a victory that boosted George II's reputation as a leader and warrior. The war also impacted Britain's relations with France, as both nations continued to compete for dominance in Europe and overseas. The conflict ultimately became part of a broader struggle between Britain and France that would later culminate in the 7 Years' War. George II's final years were marked by both personal challenges and significant developments in British history. By the late 1750s, his health was declining. At 73 years old, his age was beginning to take a toll, and he faced increasing difficulties with hearing and vision. Despite this, he remained active in his role as king, overseeing the British involvement in the 7 Years' War, which began in 1756. One of the most notable events of his final years was the growing influence of his grandson, the future George III. George II had a complicated relationship with his heir, Frederick, who had died unexpectedly in 1751, leaving his son as the next in line. George II's death in October 1760 marked the end of his reign, and his legacy would be carried on by his grandson, George III. George II is remembered for his role in strengthening Britain's position as a global power. His reign saw Britain emerge victorious in the 7 Years' War, expanding its colonial holdings and establishing a dominant role in international affairs. Additionally, his support for the creation of the British Museum in 1753 and his involvement in the early stages of British rule in India left a lasting impact on the cultural and political landscape. What do you think about George II's reign? Do you believe he was an underappreciated monarch who played a key role in laying the foundations for the British Empire's rise to global dominance? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more historical insights. Thank you very much for watching.